The sound of flesh, meeting flesh, echoed through the dead silent restaurant. She had just zapped the most feared man in the city. But as his cold hand clamped down on her wrist, ripping her sleeve, it wasn't anger in his dark eyes. It was absolute shock. He recognized the scar. The Onyx Room was the kind of establishment where the air smelled of aged whiskey, expensive cigars, and dangerous money. Located in the hidden underbelly of Chicago, it catered exclusively to the city's elite and its most lethal. Madeline Hayes knew she didn't fit the mold of the women who usually occupied this space. At 28, Madeline was a large, heavily built woman. She was undeniably fat, her wide hips and thick thighs a stark contrast to the waif-like, size 0 waitresses the management usually hired. Her uniform, a crisp black button-down and a tailored skirt, always felt a little too tight, clinging to the soft, heavy curves of her body. But Madeline was a survivor. She was sharp, efficient, and saw everything while pretending to see nothing. That was how you stayed alive working in a mob-owned restaurant. She took pride in her work, carrying heavy trays with ease, her soft, plump face set in a mask of polite indifference, no matter what cruelty was thrown her way. And in this world, cruelty was the currency. It was a stormy Tuesday evening, when the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted from quiet hum to suffocating tension. Dominic Russo had arrived. Dominic was the undisputed head of the Russo Syndicate, a man whose reputation was carved in blood and silence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed a quiet, terrifying stillness. Where other men blustered and shouted, Dominic commanded rooms with a mere glance. Tonight, he was accompanied by his inner circle, including his volatile underboss, Frankie. Madeline was assigned to their table. She approached with a silver tray, balancing 3 bottles of vintage Barolo, her heavy steps muffled by the plush carpets. She could feel the eyes of the men at the table drifting over her, assessing, dismissing. "Evening, gentlemen," Madeline said, her voice steady as she began to pour the wine. Frankie, who had already consumed too much scotch, sneered, his eyes raking over Madeline's full figure with naked disgust. "Jesus, Tony, couldn't they send someone who doesn't block the whole damn view? You're taking up half the room, sweetheart." The other men chuckled, a low, cruel sound. Dominic did not laugh. He sat at the head of the table, his dark eyes fixed on his glass, swirling the red liquid, his face an unreadable mask. Madeline felt the familiar sting of humiliation prick at the corners of her eyes, but she swallowed it down. She had dealt with worse than a drunk mobster making fat jokes. She finished pouring Frankie's glass and moved to the next. "Did you hear me, Shamu?" Frankie taunted, his voice rising. He reached out, his thick fingers grabbing the soft flesh of Madeline's waist. Madeline stiffened, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Please let go of me, sir," she said, her voice tight but remarkably calm. "Or what?" Frankie challenged, standing up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He yanked her arm, causing the heavy silver tray to tilt. A single glass of expensive red wine tipped over, splashing across the pristine white tablecloth and splattering directly onto the lapel of Dominic Russo's custom-tailored suit. The entire restaurant went dead silent. The music seemed to stop. The clinking of glasses ceased. Frankie's face went pale. He immediately released Madeline and took a step back. "Boss, I didn't mean... this stupid, clumsy cow." Dominic stood up slowly. He didn't look at Frankie. He didn't look at the stain on his suit. His cold, predatory gaze locked onto Madeline. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The sheer proximity of the man was overwhelming. He radiated a dangerous heat. Madeline was terrified, but something else flared inside her chest. A sudden, blinding rage. For years, she had been pushed around, mocked for her body, treated like invisible collateral damage by men who thought they owned the world. Dominic reached out, his large hand gripping Madeline's right arm just above the elbow. His grip was like a vice of solid steel, meant to pull her closer, perhaps to intimidate her, perhaps to throw her out. But Madeline snapped. The trauma, the humiliation, the sheer injustice of it all boiled over. Driven by pure, unadulterated instinct, her left hand flew up in a wide arc. Smack! The sound cracked through the onyx room like a gunshot. Madeline had slapped Dominic Russo squarely across the jaw. Guns were drawn instantly. The metallic clacking of hammers being pulled back echoed from 5 different directions. Madeline froze, the horrific realization of what she had just done crashing over her. Her palm stung violently. She looked at Dominic, expecting to see her own death reflected in his eyes. Dominic's head had turned slightly from the force of the blow. He slowly brought his face back to center. The restaurant held its collective breath. Slowly, Dominic's hand slid down from Madeline's elbow, his fingers wrapping around her wrist in a crushing grip. As he pulled her arm down roughly, the cheap fabric of her uniform sleeve caught on the edge of the table and tore, ripping upward to her elbow. Madeline gasped, trying to yank her arm away, desperate to hide her forearm. But Dominic didn't let go. His eyes dropped to the exposed flesh of her inner arm. There, stark against her pale skin, was a massive, jagged burn scar. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. It was shaped like a sprawling, distorted crown, wrapped in thorns, the unmistakable branding iron insignia of the Moretti family. Dominic's breath hitched. The murderous rage that had just begun to surface in his eyes vanished, replaced by an expression of profound shock. He stared at the scar, tracing the jagged edges of the burn with his eyes, a ghost from his past, suddenly standing before him in the shape of a terrified, plus-size waitress. "Who are you?" Dominic whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "Let me go!" Madeline cried out, struggling against his grip, her face flushed red with exertion and terror. Her heavy chest heaved, pulling in desperate breaths of air. She tried to yank her sleeve down, to cover the brand that she had spent 5 years hiding from the world. Dominic didn't release her. He raised a hand, a single, sharp gesture to his men. "Put them away," he barked, not taking his eyes off Madeline. "Boss, she just assaulted you," Frankie stammered, his gun still half raised. "I'll put a bullet in her heavy—" "I said put it away, Frankie," Dominic roared, the sheer volume of his voice making the glass on the table tremble. Frankie holstered his weapon immediately, taking a submissive step back. Dominic turned his intense gaze back to Madeline. "Walk with me," he commanded. It wasn't a request. He kept his iron grip on her wrist, pulling her through the paralyzed dining room, past the gaping patrons, and toward the heavy mahogany doors that led to the private back offices of the onyx room. Madeline stumbled slightly, her sensible work shoes slipping on the polished wood floors, but she forced herself to keep up, terrified of what would happen if she fell. He dragged her into a lavishly decorated office, the door slamming shut behind them with a finality that made Madeline flinch. He let go of her wrist and she immediately stumbled back, putting the large oak desk between them. She cradled her arm against her full stomach, desperately trying to pull the torn fabric of her sleeve back over the jagged scar. "Sit down," Dominic ordered, pouring himself a glass of whiskey from a crystal decanter. "I prefer to stand," Madeline shot back, her voice shaking but defiant. If she was going to die tonight, she wasn't going to do it cowering in a chair. Dominic stopped pouring and looked at her. Really looked at her. He took in her wide, defensive stance, the soft curves of her face tight with fear, the fierce, unyielding light in her brown eyes. She was heavy, soft in places his usual companions were sharp, yet she possessed a defiant steel that intrigued him. He walked around the desk, leaning against the edge of it, crossing his arms over his broad chest. 5 years ago, Dominic began, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous baritone. The Hawthorne warehouse on the south side burned to the ground. It was ruled an accident by the corrupt police force. But I knew it wasn't. The Moretti family burned it to send a message. My younger brother, Luca, was inside that warehouse. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. "The Morettis don't leave witnesses," Dominic continued, taking a slow step toward her. "They brand the ones they torture before they kill them. A sick little calling card. My men scoured the ashes. We found Luca. We found the guards. But the medical examiner noted that there was blood trailing away from the back exit. Someone survived. Someone got away. For 5 years, I have turned this city upside down, looking for the ghost who walked out of the Hawthorne fires." He reached out, much gentler this time, and took her wrist. Madeline was too stunned to fight him. He pulled her arm forward, brushing his thumb millimeters away from the scarred tissue of the thorny crown. "Where did you get this, Madeline?" he asked, having read her name tag. Tears finally breached Madeline's eyes, spilling over her plump cheeks. "I was a bookkeeper," she whispered, the memories crashing into her mind with suffocating force. "I worked for a shipping company on the 3rd floor of the warehouse. I didn't know who owned the building. I was just working late. When the men in masks came, they shot everyone. I hid under a desk. They found me." She squeezed her eyes shut, a heavy sob tearing from her throat. "They dragged me out. They wanted to know the codes to the main safes. I didn't know them. I was just a low-level accountant. But the man in charge, he didn't care. He heated up a piece of iron in a trash can fire. He pressed it into my arm." Dominic's jaw tightened. "Who was it? Did you see his face?" Madeline opened her eyes, looking directly into the face of the deadliest man in Chicago. "He took off his mask because he thought I was going to burn to death." He laughed. "It was Lorenzo Moretti." Dominic's entire body went rigid. Lorenzo Moretti was the untouchable heir to the Moretti Empire. For years, Dominic suspected him, but without proof, starting a war would have brought the wrath of the entire commission down on the Russo family. But here was his proof. Here was his witness. "How did you survive?" Dominic asked, his voice thick with an emotion Madeline couldn't decipher. "I played dead," Madeline said, wiping her face with her uninjured arm. "When they set the fire and left, I dragged myself out through a basement grate. I knew the police were on their payroll. I knew hospitals would report gunshot wounds and burns. I stitched myself up. I changed my last name. I gained 80 pounds hiding in cheap apartments, eating garbage, terrified to show my face. I gave up my career, my life, and took a job waiting tables in the dark because I thought Lorenzo would never look for me in a place like this. Dominic stared at the woman before him. Society might have overlooked her, dismissed her as just a fat, clumsy waitress taking up too much space. But Dominic saw a survivor, a woman who had endured the sadistic torture of Lorenzo Moretti, dragged herself out of an inferno, and completely rebuilt her existence under the noses of the most dangerous men in the city. I didn't see weakness in her soft curves. He saw armor. He saw a warrior who had just slapped him in front of his entire crew because she refused to be bullied 1 second longer. "Lorenzo Moretti thinks he buried you," Dominic said quietly, pulling a crisp linen handkerchief from his pocket and handing it to her. "He thinks his secret is safe." Madeline took the handkerchief, dabbing her eyes. "If you know I'm alive, he'll find out. You have to let me go. I have to run again." "No," Dominic said, the word hitting the room like a gavel. "You are done running." Madeline looked up, fear flashing back into her eyes. "What are you going to do to me?" Dominic stepped closer, looming over her. Yet, for the first time that night, Madeline didn't feel the urge to step back. "You owe me a debt, Madeline Hayes. You slapped a mafia boss in front of his men. By the laws of my world, your life belongs to me now." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intense, burning promise. "But I'm not going to kill you. You are going to help me burn Lorenzo Moretti's empire to the ground. And in return, I will give you your life back." The transition from a cramped, drafty apartment in the slums to the sprawling, hyper-secure Russo estate on the edge of Lake Michigan was jarring, to say the least. Madeline found herself standing in a guest bedroom that was larger than her entire previous floor plan. The walls were adorned with genuine silk wallpaper, and the bed, a massive mahogany four-poster, was draped in heavy velvet. Yet despite the luxury, Madeline knew exactly what this was: a beautifully gilded cage. She was under the protection of Dominic Russo, but she was also his prisoner until Lorenzo Moretti was destroyed. For the first week, Madeline rarely saw Dominic. She was attended to by Rosa, a stoic older housekeeper who ensured Madeline was fed rich, extravagant meals that Madeline barely touched out of sheer anxiety. She spent her days pacing the length of her room, her bare feet sinking into the plush Persian rugs, her mind racing. She had spent 5 years meticulously hiding, burying the intelligent, ambitious accountant she used to be beneath layers of oversized clothing and a manufactured, meek persona. Now, Dominic was demanding she resurrect the very ghost she had tried to kill. On the 8th night, the heavy oak door to her room opened. Dominic stepped inside, the faint scent of cigar smoke and expensive cologne following him. He had taken off his suit jacket, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the shadowed hollow of his throat. He looked exhausted, the lines around his dark eyes deeper than before, but his gaze was as piercing as ever. He carried a thick leather portfolio, which he unceremoniously dropped onto the small glass coffee table, sitting between 2 velvet armchairs. "We have a problem," Dominic said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in Madeline's chest. He gestured for her to sit. Madeline hesitated, wrapping her thick, knitted cardigan tighter around her broad shoulders. She moved slowly, lowering her heavy frame into one of the chairs, keeping her knees pressed firmly together. "What kind of problem?" she asked, her voice betraying a slight tremor. Dominic sank into the chair opposite hers, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "Lorenzo has insulated himself. After the Hawthorne warehouse burned, he restructured his entire money laundering operation. We know he's moving millions through legitimate front companies, but we can't find the central ledger. My hackers, my insiders, everyone hits a brick wall. The coding system he uses for his offshore accounts is archaic. It's entirely localized, entirely manual. Madeline stared at the portfolio. A strange, forgotten spark ignited in the back of her mind. "Let me see," she murmured, reaching out with a trembling hand to open the leather flap. Inside were dozens of intercepted financial documents, shipping manifests, and banking transfers. They were a chaotic mess of numbers and symbols. As Madeline scanned the pages, the fear that had been gripping her heart began to recede, replaced by the cold, analytical comfort of mathematics. "He hasn't changed it," she whispered, her eyes widening in realization. "He thinks he's so smart, but he's just arrogant. This isn't archaic, Dominic. It's a closed-loop cryptographic cipher. It looks manual because it requires a physical key to decipher the digital routing numbers." Dominic watched her intently. He watched the way her soft, plump features transformed from terrified prey to a sharp, focused predator. "You understand this?" he asked, a hint of genuine respect coloring his tone. "I didn't just balance his checkbooks, Dominic," Madeline said, looking up, her brown eyes flashing with sudden intensity. "I audited his entire shadow network before I knew what it was. I built the foundation for this cipher. He tweaked it after he burned the warehouse, but the architecture is mine. I know how he hides the money, but knowing how isn't enough. The physical decryption key, a localized flash drive, has to be accessed from his primary server." Before Dominic could respond, the door burst open. Frankie, Dominic's volatile underboss, stormed into the room, his face flushed with anger. "Boss, this is a massive waste of time. The guys are getting restless. We look weak hiding out here while Lorenzo takes over the docks. You're trusting this broad?" Frankie sneered, his eyes dropping to Madeline's heavy figure with familiar disdain. "She's a waitress, Dominic. Look at her. She's probably eating us out of house and home while feeding you lies to save her own skin." Dominic stood up, his movements fluid and terrifyingly fast. In a fraction of a second, he crossed the space between them, his hand shooting out to grip Frankie by the throat. He slammed the underboss against the silk-lined wall, the impact shaking the picture frames. "You speak to her with respect, Frankie," Dominic snarled, his face inches from his second-in-command, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "She possesses more intelligence in her little finger than you have in your entire miserable existence. She is the weapon that will take down Lorenzo. You will treat her as such, or I will cut your tongue out and feed it to the dogs. Do you understand me?" Frankie gasped for air, his eyes bulging as he nodded frantically. Dominic released him, and Frankie crumpled, coughing violently before scrambling out of the room without looking back. Dominic smoothed his shirt and turned back to Madeline. She was staring at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one had ever defended her like that. No one had ever looked past her weight, past her scars, to see the value beneath. "Where is his primary server?" Dominic asked, his voice returning to its calm, calculating cadence, as if he hadn't just nearly strangled a man. Madeline took a deep breath, grounding herself in the reality of the situation. "It's not in a warehouse or an office," she said firmly. "Lorenzo keeps his enemies close and his money closer. The server is hidden inside his private residence in the Gold Coast. And the only time the security protocol is lowered to allow for external decryption is during his annual charity gala. the one he hosts this Saturday. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Dominic's face. It was the smile of a wolf who had finally cornered its prey. Then it seems, Madeline Hayes, that you and I have a party to attend. The night of Lorenzo Moretti's charity gala, the sky over Chicago was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a downpour that never came. The opulent ballroom of the Moretti estate was a sea of glittering diamonds, sharp tuxedos, and whispered betrayals. It was a gathering of the city's most corrupt elite, masking their sins behind champagne flutes and exorbitant donations to fake orphanages. Madeline stood in the shadows of the grand foyer, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified, yet as she looked down at herself, a profound sense of power washed over her. Dominic had not sent her to a table to be squeezed, compressed, or hidden. Instead, he had commissioned a masterpiece. She wore a custom-designed gown of deep midnight blue velvet. The heavy fabric draped perfectly over her large, soft curves, accentuating her full hips and large bust while moving with a liquid grace. The sleeves were long and elegant, carefully designed to conceal the horrific brand on her arm. But the neckline plunged daringly, framed by a delicate necklace of genuine sapphires Dominic had insisted she wear. Her dark hair was swept up in an intricate, regal style. For the first time in her life, Madeline didn't just feel accepted in her heavy body. She felt beautiful. She felt dangerous. Dominic stepped up beside her. He was breathtaking in a bespoke black tuxedo that highlighted his broad shoulders and narrow waist. He looked down at her, his dark eyes sweeping over her form, a flicker of raw, undisguised admiration in his gaze. "You look magnificent," he murmured, offering her his arm. "Are you ready, my ghost?" "I'm ready," Madeline said, slipping her hand through his arm. They entered the ballroom, and the effect was immediate. The chatter died down as heads turned. Dominic Russo, the reclusive, ruthless boss of the rival syndicate, walking openly into Lorenzo's stronghold, was shocking enough. But the woman on his arm, a stunning, statuesque, plus-sized woman, radiating confidence and mystery, sent whispers rippling through the crowd like a shockwave. From across the room, Lorenzo Moretti spotted them. He was a handsome man with cruel, calculating eyes, dressed impeccably in midnight blue. Madeline felt a spike of pure terror shoot through her veins as Lorenzo's gaze locked onto hers. The last time she had seen those eyes, he was laughing while pressing searing iron into her flesh. She forced herself to breathe, to stand tall. 5 years and 80 pounds had drastically changed her appearance. To Lorenzo, she was just a new, unusual prize on his rival's arm. Dominic led her onto the dance floor, pulling her close. His hand rested firmly on her lower back, a solid, grounding presence. "He's watching you," Dominic whispered against her ear, their bodies swaying to the slow jazz music. "Keep him distracted. Frankie and the team are cutting the security feeds on the West Wing. Now, you have 5 minutes to get to the server room upstairs." "Be careful," Madeline breathed, looking up into his eyes. "Always," Dominic replied. He spun her gracefully, releasing her just as the song ended. Madeline slipped away into the crowd, utilizing her years of blending into the background. She navigated the opulent hallways, slipping past distracted guards, relying on the blueprints she had memorized. She reached the heavy mahogany door of Lorenzo's private study. Taking a deep breath, she bypassed the electronic lock using the administrative backdoor code she had designed years ago. The door clicked open, and she slipped inside, locking it behind her. The study was dark, dominated by a massive server rack humming quietly in the corner. Madeline rushed to the terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She bypassed the firewalls, her mind slipping effortlessly back into the complex algorithms she had built. She inserted the encrypted drive Dominic had given her, downloading the entire, unredacted history of Lorenzo Moretti's criminal empire. The murders, the bribes, the trafficking routes. Just as the progress bar hit 99%, the heavy study door shuddered. Someone was trying to get in. Madeline's blood ran cold. The download finished. She yanked the drive free and shoved it into the hidden pocket of her velvet gown. The door burst open with a deafening crash. The lights flicked on, blinding her temporarily. Standing in the doorway, holding a silenced pistol, was Lorenzo Moretti. Well, well, Lorenzo purred, stepping into the room and closing the broken door behind him. I thought it was strange that Russo brought such a heavy, unremarkable woman to my gala. I assumed you were just a distraction. But you're a thief. He raised the gun, aiming it directly at her chest. Hand over whatever you just took, sweetheart, and I might make your death quick. Madeline stood frozen by the server. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but then the anger returned. The blinding, righteous rage that had allowed her to slap Dominic Russo weeks ago flared back to life. She was not a victim anymore. You don't recognize me, do you, Lorenzo? Madeline asked, her voice eerily calm. She took a slow step forward, the heavy velvet of her gown sweeping across the floor. Lorenzo narrowed his eyes, keeping the gun steady. Should I? I've killed a lot of people. It's hard to keep track. Madeline reached up with her right hand and slowly, deliberately, grabbed the left sleeve of her expensive gown. With a violent jerk, she ripped the delicate seam open, exposing her inner forearm. The jagged, ugly scar of the thorny crown glared under the harsh fluorescent lights of the study. Lorenzo's smug expression shattered. The color drained from his face as he stared at the brand. Impossible, he whispered, his hand shaking slightly. The Hawthorne warehouse. There were no survivors. I watched it burn. You watched the building burn, Lorenzo, Madeline said, her voice turning into a lethal hiss. You didn't watch me die. I crawled out of the ashes you made. I hid in the dark. I carried the weight of your sins on my body for 5 years. Lorenzo recovered his shock, a cruel sneer twisting his features. A tragic reunion. But it ends the same way. Goodbye, ghost. His finger tightened on the trigger. Bang. The gunshot shattered the silence of the room, but the bullet did not hit Madeline. Lorenzo screamed, dropping his pistol as his knee shattered. He collapsed onto the floor, writhing in agony. Standing in the hidden doorway, behind the server racks, a secret passage Madeline had mapped out for this exact contingency, was Dominic Russo, a smoking gun in his hand. He stepped into the room, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying fury. Dominic walked over to Lorenzo, kicking the dropped pistol across the room. He looked down at the bleeding mob boss with utter disgust. Then, the sound of blaring sirens began to echo through the estate, growing louder by the second. What did you do? Lorenzo gasped, clutching his shattered knee. I didn't bring my men to you, Lorenzo, Dominic said coldly. That would just start a war. I brought the FBI. The drive Madeline just secured contains every piece of evidence they need to put you in a black site for the rest of your miserable life. Your empire is gone. Dominic turned away from the whimpering Lorenzo and walked over to Madeline. He looked at her ripped sleeve, gently taking her arm and running his thumb just above the scarred tissue. His eyes softened, the ruthless mafia boss disappearing, leaving only a man looking at the woman who had saved him as much as he had saved her. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Madeline looked from Lorenzo, broken and defeated on the floor, to the dark, intense eyes of Dominic Russo. The burden she had carried for 5 long years suddenly felt incredibly light. "I'm perfect," Madeline smiled, pulling him into a fierce, triumphant kiss as the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the windows. What a breathtaking finale. Madeline didn't just survive. She used her brilliance and her tragic past to completely dismantle the man who ruined her life, finding unexpected love and total acceptance with Dominic Russo along the way. Her scars became her strength, and her revenge was absolute perfection. If you were captivated by Madeline's incredible journey from a traumatized waitress to a powerful mafia queen, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite twist and hit the notification bell for more thrilling stories.